Hello and welcome back to another We Are Sunderland podcast. Matty Hewitt joined by Scott Wilson this morning. How are you, Scott?
I'm all right, Matty. Hope you're well.
Yeah, well, there's lots to discuss, but first of all, obviously, We Are Sunderland. We've just recently launched. You can take advantage of our launch offer. So there's 6 months available worth of top quality coverage for just £1. We're in partnership with the Sunderland Fan Museum, who also do great work in the community, and it is one of the best places to go for a pre-match pint. I went there yesterday before the game. The place was packed to the rafters. It was only 9:30. It had only been open half an hour. So, Scott,
That sounds about right. That sounds about right.
It was. It's great inside though. There's plenty of memorabilia that you can go and look at. Just one of the best places to go for a pint. I mean, Scott, one place to start, and that is on the derby. Now the dust's settled a little bit. What did you make of the game overall?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, what are we now? It's Sunday morning, chance to reflect a little bit. I think from a Sunderland perspective, the main emotion has to be one of just disappointment that it wasn't made harder for Newcastle. I think in their heart of hearts, most Sunderland fans would have accepted that the reality is that Newcastle are a better team in a different position than Sunderland at the minute. So if that's the case, what you've got to do is you've just got to make life uncomfortable for them. You've got to ask them questions. You've got to make life hard for them. And I think that is the real intense disappointment of yesterday, that the narrative before the game was all kind of based around the fact that Sunderland were in effect rolling out the red carpet for Newcastle off the pitch. And the sad thing is that really that's what happened on it, isn't it? Newcastle didn't feel like they had to work particularly hard to leave the Stadium of Light with a 3-0 win. And that's what sticks in the throat, I think, from a Sunderland point of view. The fact that no real stage, other than maybe 5 minutes in the second half when Pritchard had those 2 shots, at no other stage really did it feel like Newcastle were being asked serious questions. And that's the big disappointment out the day.
Yeah, that I think you just hit the nail on the head. But I mean, Newcastle as well, to be honest, first 20 minutes, maybe they didn't particularly look like they didn't ask a lot of great deal of questions of Sunderland's backline. I don't think it's hard, isn't it, when you've conceded 3-0, because I don't think Sunderland actually defended too badly. But when they did, it was shockers.
It was very badly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think the question, the key question is, did Sunderland get their approach wrong? And I would say, yes, they did. I would argue that there's probably reasons for that. Now, okay, if we accept that Newcastle are man for man a better team than Sunderland, and like I say, I think even every Sunderland fan deep down will probably accept that, then it seems pretty pointless trying to out-football them and play them off the pitch, because 99 times out of 100, you're probably not going to be able to do that. And yet that's the approach that Sunderland adopted. They were playing out from the back. They were trying to play a possession-based game, even when they should have been chasing the game. Even when it was apparent that Newcastle had pretty much total control of midfield, Sunderland was still trying to play through there. Now, why were they doing that? I suspect, and from speaking to Michael Beale after the game, like we both did, listen, he's a head coach who's gone in there. He's 4 weeks into the job. He's trying to get these players to play the style of football that he wants to play, which is possession-based, which is going to be playing out from the back, which is going to be dictating possession, which is going to be taking risks at times with the ball. Yeah. In the Championship, A, Sunderland have players who are good enough to do that most of the time, and B, they're playing against teams who probably aren't going to massively take advantage if it goes wrong every now and then. The problem is that wasn't the case yesterday. They're playing against a Premier League team who are going to take advantage. But to give Michael Beale a slight pass here, I understand why he was reluctant 3 weeks into his job on last Wednesday afternoon to say to the players, look, all this stuff I've been telling you about holding on the ball, taking risks, doing this, doing that. Well, actually, forget about it on Saturday. I just want you to get in their faces, lump it long when you're under pressure. I understand why he didn't want to do that, to effectively say to the players, all this stuff I'm telling you, I don't really believe in it when you come up against a team that's better than you. I understand why he didn't want to go down that route. Now, that's still not to say he couldn't have made some tactical tweaks. It's still not to say that he couldn't have made some more substitutions, because I think, even though he explained after the game that he thought things were going okay and he wasn't really sure about what else he had on the bench, I thought it was strange that he didn't at least try to do something different in those last 20 minutes when the game clearly needed to change or it had already gone. So I think there's question marks that can justifiably be levelled at the way that he coached that game and managed that game. But I think the overriding idea that he didn't want to rip up everything that he's trying to get into the players and wants them to do long term, I do understand that.
Yeah, just again, I can only really reiterate what you said there. It's difficult, isn't it? He touched on the fact you've got to take the game for what it is. It's not, yes, it's a derby game and there's a lot of emotion behind the game, but look at where the two clubs are. I mean, Newcastle, Alexander Isak probably costs more one player than what a whole of Sunderland's squad does all together. I mean, again, the first half in particular, they didn't really lay a glove on Newcastle, which, like you said before, that was the one frustrating thing for me as well. Is, we've given Jack Clarke so much praise as well, in particular for the way that he's performed. He's been one of the best players in the Championship this year, and I don't know if it's a bit of both, whether he just had an off day. Kieran Trippier had a really good game. I would have liked to see him get in behind a bit more. You could see briefly first 5-10 minutes or so what they tried to do with Pritchard. I think they tried to do a repeat of what they did against Preston, come inside a bit into a number 10 position, leave a bit of space for Trey Hume, but that just didn't work. When you've got someone who's a willing runner like Anthony Gordon to track back, Newcastle are so well coached and so well drilled with their pressing game, how they set up. And I think Jack Clarke, again, he just didn't. Don't get us wrong. He got back and he got in, dropped in, but there was stages in the second half where he was walking about and Trippier was free to just advance up the pitch. Our GLSA was just 2-on-1 at times.
I think Clarke's an interesting one because listen, Sunderland didn't lose the game because Jack Clarke underperformed. There's plenty of players you can point the finger at and say, well, you didn't quite play up to standard. But the fact is that Jack Clarke has been Sunderland's talisman so far this season. He's being touted as potential January or summer, this, that, and the other in terms of Premier League. Well, I think there was two, and I think in terms of both Clarke and Joe Bellingham, you felt going into yesterday's game that if someone going to win that game, one or both of them were probably going to have to be the magic ingredient. And unfortunately, neither were. And maybe that's because that's the stage of the development that they're at. I think that's probably maybe true with Bellingham, that, he's had a great start to his Sunderland career, but it's very easy to forget how young and inexperienced he actually is, even in Championship terms. So to expect him to run rings around Fabian Schär and Sven Botman is probably a bit unrealistic, really. Clarke's a little bit different because he is knocking on the door of a Premier League move. And you're right. I think it was disappointing the way that every time he looked to cut inside and do what he's been doing in the Championship this year, Kieran Trippier seemed to know, half a second before Clarke did it, exactly where he was going and just blocked him off as easy as you like. I did think for all the stick he might have got, Trippier did have a good game. And Clarke kind of played into his hands a bit. But then what was also glaringly apparent, I think you're right to point to it, is the contrast in just the amount of work that Clarke gets through at the minute in a game compared to Gordon or Almiron in similar positions for Newcastle, whose game really starts with pressing the opposition defence, coming back to protect whoever's behind them, just being a nuisance, certainly with Almiron. Clarke, if he's going to get to where he wants to get to, is going to have to add a bit of that to his game, because the days when top Premier League wingers can kind of wander around, Pep Guardiola doesn't let Jack Grealish get away with that. He doesn't let Phil Foden get away with that. Both of them haven't been able to get a game at various stages of the Man City team because he effectively doesn't think they work hard enough and hang on to the ball well enough. Well, if he's wanting that off them, then I think it's fair that managers are going to want the same off Jack Clarke. And I just thought you're right. Certainly in the second half of yesterday's game, there was times when Alazy was being left horribly exposed because Clarke was literally 40 yards down the field, not tracking back. And that's something that, he's going to have to add to his game if he wants to get to where we all think he's probably eventually going to be capable of getting to, hopefully with Sunderland or somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, it's again question marks with Michael Beale. I know it's early on, but he said, we'll give Jack Clarke allowances. In my opinion, that wasn't the game to give him an allowance. You need him back in there. I know there's levels. There's obviously levels. There was a gap in. Michael Beale said it before in his press conference, didn't he? Saying, look, there was a gap in quality before they came into the game. There was a gap at the end. I feel like there was a similar sort of, Pierre-Emerick didn't have his best day at all by any stretch of the imagination. But if you contrast him to Dan Neil, I thought, who was next to him, who was one of, if not Sunderland's best player, he showed the tenacity in centre midfield to hassle and harry. And if they'd had two Dan Neils, they might have had a different outcome in the game. It's just about levels, isn't it? The Ekwa and Clark, similar sort of things. You just wanted them to just give a little bit more, defensive work rate. Again, there's levels to it.
I think with Ekwa, I think you're right. I think probably what yesterday showed is certainly at the moment, Dan Neil is a significant chunk ahead of Ekwa in terms of his ability to be able to cope with that environment, that intensity, that speed of game, that quality of central midfielder around him. I just think that's the reality at the minute, that Dan Neil is in a different position to where Pierre-Emerick is at the minute. Now, that's not to say that Ekwa can't eventually catch up. And that's not to say that this is the ceiling for Neil, because I think he can definitely still kick on and add an awful lot. But at the moment, I think what yesterday showed is Dan Neil is much better attuned and able to cope with everything that was thrown at him in terms, not the outside stuff, not the Derby atmosphere. I'm talking about coming up against world-class centre midfielders. Dan Neil looked like he could handle that. Pierre-Emerick, with the greatest will in the world, didn't. Now, with Jack Clark, I think it's interesting because I think in most championship home games, Michael Beale's probably right to say to Jack Clark, look, you're the one who can unlock this packed defence against a side who's sitting back, not really interested in holding on to the ball, just wants to break against us. Don't you worry about tracking back too much. You're the key to getting through this defence. Focus on that. And that's what Clark's done brilliantly in the championship this year. And I think that's going to be what Clark's job will be between now and the end of the season. So I'm not saying week in, week out, Jack Clark needs to massively change what he's doing, because it's clearly working against most championship defences. You're right to say that yesterday against a fullback in Kieran Trippier who's seen it all and played against, world-class kind of wingers for England and in the Champions League, etc., he probably had to do something a little bit different, and he just had to work a little bit harder when it wasn't going well for him. I think that's what we're seeing, isn't it? But against Rotherham at home, or against, Swansea at home, or whatever, who just want to sit in and you need that little spark of something. Well, Jack Clark's been brilliant at that for Sunderland this season, so that's still what you're going to want him to do in most matches. Yeah,
he has been the talismanic figure. Somebody else who's impressed as well, particularly over the festive period, is Alex Pritchard. I mean, I thought, they struggled. The problem was yesterday, Sunderland struggled to get the forward players into the game as well, didn't they? It broke down from midfield into the final third. But second half, when I don't know if a part of that was maybe Joe Linton going off, Newcastle lost a bit of physicality in the middle. Did they step off? Plenty of questions. But Pritchard in the second half, he looked the most like creating anything. And, for him to be the most experienced player who's dealt with that sort of environment before, even then he's not played in a Wear-Tyne Derby, he's played in the Premier League, there's questions put to Michael Beale afterwards, wasn't there? Would he like more experience in his squad? And you look back to last summer, the Pritchard was tipped to leave, wasn't he? I mean, Beale stressed the importance of not straying away from the model that they have of, developing young talent. But I do still think that they need one or two wiser heads, someone with a bit more nous, not just to see out those type of games. Look, they're not going to come up against Newcastle week in, week out in the Championship, but there's games, particularly the game at Rotherham, I thought they needed just to move the ball a bit quicker. They needed an experienced head on the pitch, someone who's won different, won games in a different manner.
I think you're right, and I think Tony Mowbray felt that was the case, didn't he? Now, Michael Beale, whether he believes it or not, I think we probably are going to have to accept that he's come into the job knowing that he can't really come out and say that, because it's not going to happen. Sunderland aren't going to go out in January or next summer and sign 2 or 3 30-year-olds. It's just not going to happen. So in a certain extent, they're stuck with what they've got. Now, that's not to say that there's going to be a decision to be made over Alex Pritchard. Is he going to become the next Danny Bath, the next Lyndon Gooch, and he's out the door because Sunderland don't want to offer him a new long-term deal, and there's a chance to get a little bit of money for him, and that's cashed in. I agree with you. I think that will be a retrograde step, because I think that at the moment, he is offering this Sunderland squad an awful lot in terms of, like you say, creativity, just game management now a little bit as well. I mean, he was the only one, Dan nailed it with a slight degree, but he was the only one who, when he got the ball and actually drove forward with it, Sunderland ended up 20 yards further up the pitch yesterday. And it sounds a fairly simple thing, but again, against the quality of midfielders that you're up against yesterday, it's not an easy thing to do. But he was the only one who actually identified those pockets of space in the second half and nearly made something out of them. And yeah, I think Sunderland have to keep him, but do I think that'll happen? I wouldn't like to think I was gambling my mortgage on it, because it just doesn't seem to be the way that the decision-making process at the club at the moment is around now. I've felt this all along, that, I think the way Sunderland broadly are trying to do things is right.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that you're starting to see a lot of other Championship clubs, Middlesbrough just down the road, that obviously we cover at the Northern Echo as well, being a very good example of it, where they're going down a very similar route of predominantly signing young, relatively unproven players, often from overseas, with development potential, with sell-on potential. But the difference at Borough is they're not afraid every now and then to throw in an experienced loan signing, or bring in someone a little bit different. Darragh Lenihan, for example, wouldn't fit the Sunderland mold, but Borough thought, you know what, we probably need someone like that in our back four. Matt Clark, who's playing there at the minute, let's bring him in. I think there's a need for Sunderland for a little bit of flexibility to bring in an odd signing like that, or to hold on to an odd Alex Pritchard when they clearly have an awful lot still to offer.
Yeah, again, I suppose it's difficult as well, isn't it? You look, they haven't not done that, because they've signed the likes of Bradley Dack, for example, Corey Evans. They have done it in the past. You just feel like there may be 2 or 3 short or missing. They don't need to reinvent the wheel, because I think everybody knows, look, since they've come in and they've put this model in place, it has been year-on-year progression. I think perhaps the only frustration comes from the fact that they are so close, I think personally, to being a really, really good Championship team. And I do think it's staring them in the face a little bit. That's not to say that, it's going massively wrong. It's far from it. They are doing a good job. They have done a good job of recruitment. It's more of a sense of, everybody knows these young players will take time to adapt, to get used to the way of playing. It's maybe just they've over-egged it a tiny bit. The 4 strikers, that was a topic of discussion. They hadn't scored. One of them has, but now the system that they're playing as well, they're playing with a single focal point up front as a striker. So you've got 3 sat on the bench, and then just yesterday to not bring one on, you brought Bar on for Rooston. It just, why have they gone down that route is more of the point I'm trying to make.
The lack of subs was an interesting one, and for Beale to even just hint after the game that, I think his words were to the effect of, "Well, I looked behind me and it was even younger still." That's suggesting that, what am I going to gain by throwing on a Mayenda or a Lewis Hamia with 10 minutes left? Because I just don't think at the minute they're up to it. Now, again, the caveat and the get out a little bit is, just because they're not up to it against Newcastle doesn't mean they're not up to it against half the teams in the Championship who they're actually going to be playing against. Had that been a home game against Plymouth, I'm pretty sure that he would have thrown 2 or 3 of them on, because offering something against Plymouth is different to offering something against Newcastle. So, we've got to always keep couching this in the fact that they were playing against a team who were playing in the Champions League last month. So you've still got that, but the principle does still hold that actually, if he's looking there and saying, I'm reluctant to make those changes because I think they're too young and inexperienced. Well, if in January you're going to bring in another young and inexperienced striker, then is that actually going to help the situation?
Yeah, it's exactly that, isn't it? I mean, like I've said, they're not far off being a really good team. It's January itself is going to be a really interesting month. Like, just for the likes of the players that we've touched on there, like Jack Clark, Dan Neil, that Jack Clark might not have had his best game against Newcastle. Again, there's levels to it. They're not going to be playing against a Champions League team, but there's no getting away from the fact he's been Sunderland's talisman. He's been their bright spark. Keeping a hold of those players this month, Sunderland are in a good position to do so because of the length of the contract. But that will be hugely important as well. They're not far away. That's worth stressing the point. They're not far away at all.
Yeah. What do you think then? Now that the dust, like I say, is starting to settle on it, what do you think about the kind of week as a whole, the fortnight as a whole, the derby as a whole? Because it's felt like a really bad few weeks for the ownership, and a lot of goodwill has been lost. Now, to what extent is that going to impact the rest of the season? Or to what extent is it possible to draw a line under that now and say, right, okay, they've made mistakes. I think they know they've made mistakes. Yes, there needs to be an investigation to why certain things happened. We all know that. But to what extent can it be parked now? Or to what extent is that going to actually damage, not necessarily the mood around the club, but the way in which, let's be honest, Kirill and Christian and people like that are the esteem that they're held in, or the status that they have? How much damage has all of this really done, do you think?
I don't actually think we'll know the true extent of that until the end of the season, if I'm honest.
That's a fair point.
Where they'll finish, I don't think it's worth. The problem we have in football, isn't it? Like anybody, when you're so passionate about something, you can go one way and go over the top, or you can go the other and play it off down, completely. I think that it's in the middle. That, like you've said there, the club's accepted that they've made errors. But I also think that, somebody does need to be held accountable for that, because it was just a mess. The build up to that was a mess.
Yeah.
It was their first experience as well of, the Derby situation. They've made mistakes. When they came in, they said that they would make mistakes. This is probably the biggest so far. So they need to learn from that. I think the general consensus is, listen to the fans. You need to listen to the fans. And I'm not saying, go out and spend 30 million. Listen to them when they're saying buy a striker from a small minority. But listen to the fans. I think, at times they've done that well. But yeah, it's just, it was a bad week. It was a bad week. And I think the best thing will be, moving on, brush it under the carpet. The Derby, unless they get promoted this season, they're not going to have a Derby situation like that. Let it be done. Everybody knows that. Again, going back on the pitch, it was a gulf in class. But again, I think Michael Beale said that afterwards. Perspective. It was a bit of a message to where the club are, a bit of a point to actually we're not as close to the Premier League as we think. That extends to off the pitch as well. I think. They do have to improve behind the scenes, just in terms of the whole Black Cats bar debacle was just a mess.
I think you're right. I think you've hit the nail on the head, that there needs to be a better dialogue and a better understanding of what Sunderland fans want, what's important to them. In these high profile situations, especially. I think one thing that this has exposed quite rightly, as you say, is there's just not enough. There's not enough dialogue with key fans groups, etc., to find out. Well, what would you think of this? Because you'd find out quite quickly what's acceptable and what isn't.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that all of this has done, and this is a little bit unfair because it's really through no fault of his own. I do think it's put a bit more pressure on Beale.
Yeah.
Because Michael Beale, because I do think that there wasn't a groundswell against Tony Mowbray. There certainly wasn't a groundswell pro Michael Beale before he came in. Now, he's had pretty decent results in the Championship so far. I think things were just starting to settle down. But I think, what this is kind of shone a spotlight on again is the fact that I feel like Sunderland fans are almost saying to the ownership, look, we're a bit skeptical about some of the things you're doing in terms of the project you're following. But we've been willing to kind of put that on the back burner a little bit. We're a bit skeptical about what you've done with the head coach. We're a bit skeptical about some of the players you've let go in the summer. All of this is kind of built up now to actually, we're a little bit skeptical about what's going on. So if you're making these decisions, they better work. We'll back them if they work. But I do feel now that if this season gets away from Sunderland, then a real spotlight's going to be trained on what's actually happening behind the scenes at this club. And you know, I think a big chunk of that is because this last kind of 2 weeks, whatever, has been such a horror show for them.
Yeah, again, just nail on the head. I mean, the past few weeks has been just, it's such a bizarre situation to find themselves. How many championship clubs or even Premier League clubs that just say just outside the top four, championship and the playoffs, sack the manager because they felt it was a change that they needed to make. So we've obviously heard from Christian Speakman. They've explained the reasons why. But then Beale came out in his press conference, didn't he? Appointed and said, you know, well, results will dictate how successful he be viewed, and that's the same for the project as a whole. Up to this point, you can't. Yes, you can ask questions by all means. You can. I think the dialogue as well is just something that needs to improve. I mean, if there'd been a conversation leading up to this game with the fans, fan groups, just to, you know, go through, put it to them. Just
yeah. And I think what sticks in the throat a little bit is that Newcastle did that quite well. They got their fans groups involved from the word go and said, look, we've been offered 2,500 tickets, no strings attached. We've been offered 6,000 tickets with the buses and all of that. Which would you want to go for? The fans groups have said to Newcastle, we'd rather have the tickets. So straight away, what could have been a really awkward situation for Newcastle kind of hasn't become it because they've had that dialogue and it's been pretty open, and they've said, well, this is your decision as much as it's ours. They've then worked with the fans groups to organise everything at St James's Park yesterday, and there's getting people on the buses, the scarves and all of that. Now, you know, I'm not saying that Sunderland are completely oblivious to the fans, because there's evidence under this regime of really good fan dialogue, and it's infinitely better than what it was under Donald and Methven. We know that. But what this has shown is that there's still gaps there, and it could still be an awful lot better. And you know, I think they just need to accept that, for all that they might think they know how to run everything, and for all that you're right in terms of who they sign and all of that kind of stuff, that's got to be left to them. You know, you can't, that doesn't become a quorum. But there are some key decisions that they will have to make that have a direct impact on fans' experience of football matches at the Stadium of Light, that you've got to get the fans involved with and on board with, because it just creates problems if you don't, and it goes wrong as it has this week.
Yeah, I mean, again, just leading in the build-up to this game, just to go back to the point that you said on Michael Beale and a bit of pressure on him, the fans I've been speaking to at least have said, you know, we will give him time. The results he's had, obviously, aside from the Coventry game, if you give him that grace, first game, again, that was something that felt like a lot was going wrong. Fans weren't happy with giving over the ticket allocation, having to move their seats.
Yeah.
Aside from that, though, results on the pitch, performances, I think, all right, if you look at Rotherham away for what it was, a point, disappointing. Then Leeds have gone there, got a point. If you'd swap the result around, if you'd taken a point at Hull and won at Rotherham, I think 7 points from 9 is a respectable return. Beale probably felt the wrath of everything that was going on around the scenes. That there are one or two comments, whether they're from Sunderland fans or not, it's, you know, saying to get Beale out. I think that's a bit ridiculous.
No. I mean, listen, that's where I say that he's been a bit unfortunate that this is kind of the head coach, the manager's position at pretty much every football club, that because they're the ones who are always in front of the fans, and because they're the ones who are always having to justify what's going on, whether it's their kind of remit or not, they're the ones who have to take, you know, get identified with it, have to take the flak for it, and really, unfortunately, I think for Michael Beale, through no fault really of his own, a bit more pressure is going to be placed on him now in the wake of the fact that everything's gone so kind of badly wrong, and then there is this just undercurrent of general unhappiness at what's happened in the last couple of weeks. That it does put a bit more pressure on him, and that's like, you know, I'm with you. Yes, you can ask questions about the way he managed yesterday's game. That's perfectly justified, but everything else has had nothing to do with him. And actually, prior to this derby, like you say, he generally looked like he was getting on the right track. It was a reasonable enough return. Would Tony Mowbray have got the same return? We can argue that Lacau's come home. Nobody knows. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Michael Beale's the head coach now. He's got Sunderland back into the playoff positions. that's his job between now and the end of the season.
Yeah, and he doesn't have a tougher place to go, does he? Portman Road next, and Ipswich. I mean, this is such
having a little bit of a
game.
wobble. I mean, you know, not quite the team they were, but you know, we saw it on the first day of the season, didn't we? We saw the threat that Ipswich have, and they've kind of carried it all the way through since then. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, that feels like a big game now, just to, you know, because that's your opportunity to move on from this weekend. But if you're unable to do that, then the questions just become that little bit louder, that little bit more forceful. But I'm sure we'll get to that on vids later in the week, won't we?
Yeah, definitely. So thanks again, Scott, for joining us. It's great. We'll be back later on during the week. I think we'll be back tomorrow morning with another morning briefing. Don't forget, you can subscribe to our site. Launch offers £1 for 6 months worth of coverage. And we've been in partnership with the Sunderland Fan Museum.